My name is George Soroka. I'm a lecturer at Harvard University in the government department. The book I'm speaking about today is Ukraine After Maidan, Revisiting Domestic and Regional Security. It's an edited volume. It's one that I'm co-editing with Tomasz Stepniewski of the University of Lublin, Poland. In this book, we look at Ukrainian security more broadly than it's been looked at by many scholars, but certainly by many pundits. But what we contend in this book is that Ukraine's security has profound implications within the region as well, within the post-communist region and within Europe more broadly, and ultimately in a global sense as well. This is why the book covers issues such as how does the current situation in Ukraine impinge on Finland's security, for instance. So we take a much broader view of the security situation, and we consider it in terms of wider regional dynamics. And I'm really pleased that we have 7 contributors that really span a very wide range, both in terms of their theoretical orientations, in terms of their empirical methodological approaches, and also in terms of where they're located geographically. We have contributors from Russia, from Poland, from Finland, obviously from Ukraine, and from the United States as well. The fact of the matter is that both the West and Russia are, to a large extent, playing a game of realpolitik, and Ukraine is caught in the middle to some extent. There is, whether rightly or wrongly, there is a great deal of concern in the Baltic states. There's a great deal of concern in Poland, basically all of the states that border the Russian Federation and even beyond, about what this might herald. So there's, in policy circles, a tremendous amount of discussion about how to deal with Russia, because this is also a precedent for potential future conflicts. As for Russia, I think the playbook was there all along. It's pretty clear what Russia's doing. We have the example of Transnistria, very close to Ukraine. We have the example of what happened in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I don't think that Russia is trying to annex, at least at this time, the breakaway regions of the Donbass. It achieved quite a bit of, or I should say, Vladimir Putin and his regime achieved quite a bit of domestic legitimacy by retaking or annexing Crimea. This was genuinely popular back home, and that has to do partly with how the media presented it. Russia does not have anywhere near a fully free media. But in terms of moving past that, in terms of actually trying to annex parts of the Donbass, I think Russia realizes that this would be in some ways catastrophic for it. Not only would this be financially a black hole, I looked at some of the estimates about how much Russia is already paying into the separatist-held areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, and it's astronomical. This risks being another financial black hole like Chechnya for Russia. At the same time, the bigger picture for Russia is that in some ways, Russia right now is the Ukrainian nationalists' best friend, because it has essentially, by annexing Crimea and by fomenting the conflict in the east, it has taken away many of the most dependable voters, many of the most dependably pro-Russian voters. But for Russia, geopolitically, this would be a huge, huge loss if it lost its leverage, if it lost its ability to wield at least some power over Kiev and gain the Donbass, in my opinion. So how does this relate to the wider regional dynamics? Well, I think policymakers within the EU, within NATO, within capitals of Brussels and Washington, are still not exactly clear on Russia's intentions. And if I could be permitted just to step back a little bit further, I think that essentially arises from a profound disconnect from what's going on the ground in Russia. We don't have a sufficient number of experts who understand what the thinking is in the Kremlin currently. And it has to do with the fact that the policy community has essentially made that whole area, that whole post-communist area, essentially an afterthought after the 1990s. And there still is very much this perception that Ukraine is, in some respects, not a fully sovereign state. It's somehow Russia's little brother, somehow its appendage. But the fact of the matter is, I think many in the West simply don't give much thought to that area. And we're seeing the fruits of this in that we don't have policymakers who are up to speed with what's going on and up to speed with how the key actors, both in Kiev and in Moscow, think. So we're not quite sure what this conflict may portend. And this is causing a lot of systemic instability in the European security architecture. I personally don't think that Vladimir Putin is any kind of grand strategist. I think he's very good at taking advantage of opportunities that present themselves to him. But the question you posed was, what does this mean for regional security? And the short answer is, I don't know. And that is a discomforting answer to give, because it means that the security architecture is fundamentally destabilized at the moment. I don't mean in material terms, I mean conceptually. And this is why this book is coming out at this moment. We want this to be a small contribution in hopefully getting people to think, particularly policymakers, but also academics, more broadly about what this conflict portends for Europe and for essentially the wider global security infrastructure. We are living in a particularly unsettled historical time. We have the rise of the BRICS. We have the rise particularly of China. China is becoming more assertive in the South China Sea. Russia has been assertive. We have a wonderful contributor to the volume, Yuval Weber, who is a professor at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, currently based in Washington, D.C., however, Canadian by birth. So he's able to interpret these worlds from multiple perspectives. And one of the points he makes is that, there really was quite a bit of ambiguity in the Cold War settlement, that the West essentially proclaimed victory and walked away from the region. And Russia spent, a decade or so smarting over the imbalance between what it thought its status in the world should be and what it was capable of actually projecting in terms of power. But we shouldn't forget that Russia is still a nuclear power. It's still a great military power. Partly, I don't mean to say that I blame the West entirely for this, but partly as the result of this neglect, we have what we see today. We have a reassertive Russia. Russia tried it the Western way. They tried, for better or worse, with significant bumps in the road, but they did attempt some democratization. They did certainly attempt neoliberal economic reforms. And when the 98 financial crisis hit, the discussion was that this wasn't working. And then Vladimir Putin came to power and had a very different vision. And Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered, as I probably don't need to remind your viewers, in sight of the Kremlin, Boris Nemtsov had this really interesting article sometime in the early 2000s, I don't remember the exact date, where he basically characterized Putin as the luckiest man alive. And this was because, when Putin came to power, the price of oil was very low. It was somewhere, I think, even around $10 a barrel, not much more than that. And Russia really profited from the rising energy prices that occurred very rapidly in the early aughts, in the early 2000s. And this led it to become much more assertive in terms of its foreign policy ambitions and reach. Much of this was ignored or not realized or not dealt with, at least, well in the West. As for Ukraine, Ukraine has been in this, in my opinion, in this perpetual state of not knowing exactly what it is. Ukraine was based on civic principles of citizenship. So citizenship initially was granted to anyone residing within the territory of Ukraine, that this was quite different than the more exclusivist, ethnically exclusivist principles that were put into place in places like Estonia and places like Latvia. But Ukraine still hasn't quite reconciled what it is. And, this is the fact even after the Maidan. We have a government that is obviously much more pro-Western at this point. We have a Ukrainian narrative which is much more consonant with the nationalist narrative, what people tend to characterize as the more Western Ukrainian narrative now. But even though there has been quite a bit of movement in terms of popular identification with this narrative, it's by no means unitary. I was just, before we started this interview, I was just looking through some polling data, and I found that even in September 2017, based on the Kiev International Institute of Sociology polling data, in September 2017, 37% of Ukrainians, and this is excluding, by the way, the annexed territory of Crimea and the rebel-held areas, had a positive view of Russia. Yes, this is significantly down from the 88% that it was 10 years earlier. But it still talks about a fairly bifurcated, a fairly divided society. So, Ukrainian instability is an issue for it as a state. It's an issue for it as a nation, but it's also an issue for it in the larger regional scope, in the larger regional scheme of things, because it makes Ukraine's neighbors, as it makes Kiev, very nervous to see yet another, what is starting to look like a potentially low-level, maybe even frozen conflict emerging in the Donbass. Much of the polling data does break this down in finer detail, and the positive perceptions of Putin are very different than the positive perceptions of Russia as a whole. And I think that's exactly right. What you're getting at is, we can't forget one of the tragedies of the breakup of the Soviet Union was the fact that intermarriage rates, particularly among Ukrainians and Russians, were so high. And even leaving aside intermarriage rates, just the ability to move freely means that many families found themselves caught by an international border, right? This is something that they never expected. Probably a more accurate statistic would be number of Ukrainians who want to reunite with Russia. Want Ukraine to reunite with Russia, and the data on that, as I'm recalling now, was somewhere around 20% 10 years ago, and it's down to 4% now. Now, again, we have to be careful with this because almost all of the recent surveys exclude Crimea for obvious reasons, and exclude, again, for obvious reasons, the areas of Donbass where fighting is still sporadically occurring. So the numbers would undoubtedly be higher if those areas were included. But I think that gets more to the way that Russia is currently politically imagined in Ukraine, and it's on the whole quite negative. But the one thing I do want to communicate to you and your audience is that this is a very complicated picture, right? I think oftentimes what the survey data misses is that, and frankly what academics who are looking at the region miss, is that there are many ways to parse this. Just because one is a Russian speaker, to begin very simplistically, does not mean that one is in any way, shape, or form a Russian fifth column, right? A representative of Putin's regime, as I think you were getting at. Even in a more sophisticated light, though, just because one doesn't identify with Kiev doesn't mean that the default position is identification with Moscow. The survey data are quite clear that still, to this day, much of the identification in the East is with the Soviet Union. I saw a recent poll. It's not that recent. It was from May 2013. And the reason I mention is obviously it was before the Maidan. So you get kind of a background snapshot and you include all the territories. But in the East, people who basically responded that they thought life was better, that they thought the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a mistake, life was better under the Soviet Union, was somewhere around 48%. So much of this is not so much support for Russia per se. It's either nostalgia for the Soviet Union. It's this idea that there are civilizational ties and cultural ties, certainly, to Russia. And it's also this idea of a very strong regional identity that has to do with how these regions formed. And you see this in other parts of Ukraine as well, in Transcarpathia, etc. There are regional specificities that make many of the inhabitants identify more strongly, or at least in parallel, with a regional identity vis-a-vis a larger, all-encompassing Ukrainian identity. And this obviously has impact for Ukraine's internal security, but I think it also problematizes this overly simplistic narrative that essentially the choice in Ukraine right now is a civilizational choice. It's a choice between a pan-Slavic sort of Ruski Mir identity, or it's a choice between a Western European identity. That's not the choice. At least I hope not, because that if that is the choice, it portends ongoing conflict for Ukraine. I think the choice is between having a responsive state, and this is something I get into in my chapter. I think this is a choice between having a state based on civic nationalism, probably giving some priority to Ukrainian language, to Ukrainian culture, but encompassing of a wide variety, not just Russian, but also the other ethnic minorities that live and have lived for centuries in Ukraine. It's a call for having a transparent government. It's a call for having a non-corrupt government. And it's essentially a call for making Ukraine not only more attractive in ideational terms, not only attractive in terms of having the right historical interpretation or having the right culture or the right language spoken, but having Ukraine be attractive in terms of having a government that listens to its citizens, having an economic system that isn't going to demand bribes from people wanting to do the most mundane day-to-day tasks, to transact the most day-to-day mundane tasks. This is essentially what Ukraine's security, I think, is going to hinge on. And to that extent, I think much of the current discussion over things like the April 2015 so-called decommunization laws and things like the Lenin fall and historical interpretation, I frankly think that this is a lot of hand-waving. It's a lot of political prestidigitation, because in some ways it's much easier to focus on these very symbolically laden, emotional issues than to actually undertake the really hard work of starting to implement anti-corruption measures, or starting to talk about how do we actually set up a functioning multi-party system in Ukraine that isn't just beholden to the oligarchs or big business interests, whether they be from the Donbass or whether they be from more western or central regions of Ukraine. So my chapter makes the claim that there are two critical dimensions to building out Ukraine's internal security. And the first of these deal with what I call nation building and stateness. Now, Ukraine obviously has a state. So when I mean stateness, I don't mean developing a state. I mean deepening the legitimacy of the state. And that goes hand in hand with what I mentioned about making the state more responsive, making the state more transparent to its citizens, and making the state simply more attractive in terms of people wanting to belong to the state, that the state can command people's loyalty to it. The same with this idea of nationalism. So this is one bucket, stateness and nation building. And the argument made is that right now there is very much, I think, a natural inclination to move in a more nationalizing, by nationalizing I mean ethnic Ukrainian, Western Ukrainian narrative. And I think in many respects that's a mistake. What's needed is this application of a civic nationality, again, probably with granting Ukrainian language a pride of place, recognizing the culture, recognizing pivotal moments in Ukrainian history that were suppressed, the famine being chief among them, under the Soviet regime. But at the same time, making certain that citizenship is not simply based on an ethnic Ukrainian identity, that citizenship is more encompassing and can command the loyalty of the other ethnic groups, the ethnic minorities that live in Ukraine, and also the ethnic in-betweens, as I call them. This is one of the really interesting things that comes out in the survey data. There seems to be a great malleability in how people identify as Ukrainian or not, and it seems to change over time. And this partly has to do with the fact that you can't look at a Russian and a Ukrainian and tell them apart by physical features. Not really. It also has to do with the fact that intermarriage rates were so high. So people can shift identities when it's situationally expedient, right? And I think we have to keep this in mind as well, that what it means to be Ukrainian is not fixed, right? So to the extent the government can be inclusive, to the extent the government adopts policies that are pluralistic and allow for multiple interpretations of the past, historical politics has been such a touchstone and such a fraught issue in Ukraine. And my personal take on this is that it's quite a mistake to put into place official definitions of how the past should be seen. What's needed is for the government to provide a level playing field where discussions can take place. Yes, we have to have some certain parameters, but to the extent that can be done, this can serve to depoliticize the past, and you can allow for pluralistic narratives to be expressed. And this is going to be really quite critical for a state like Ukraine if it's going to deepen both its nation-building capacity and also this idea of stateness. And again, by that I mean the legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of the political conditions under which citizens of Ukraine live. So that's one category. The other category, and I argue in my piece that this is actually the more important category, is the degree and the quality of governance, because this is really critical. We talked a little bit about the survey data, and one of the other interesting things that's come out is not just through the survey data, but also through scholarship that's recently been published, is that much of what Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainians or residents of Ukraine living in the East before the conflict and even now wanted, didn't have so much to do with coming back to Russia, being folded back into the Russian fold. This whole Novorossiya project was pretty much a non-starter, both in that region and on the side of Moscow. I think Putin used that expression once in public, something like that, and pretty much abandoned it thereafter. What was really driving a lot of the dissatisfaction with Kiev was feeling that their demands weren't being heard in the Donbass, feeling that they were disenfranchised from the political process, and also feeling that their economic interests weren't heard. And this is quite central. We have data going back into the 1990s that seem to imply, let's not forget that the vote for Ukrainian independence, yes, it was lower in the East than it was in the West, but it was still a majority vote for Ukraine to become a separate country. Soviet Union dissolved. And what was driving that clearly wasn't some ethnic Ukrainian identification with a nationalizing state. It was this idea that the state of Ukraine as a separate entity could provide better economic conditions, could provide better living conditions for people. And surprise, surprise, we see the same kind of data being produced by these regions even today, that a lot of this seems to be driven by economic interests. There was a very interesting article that came out in, I believe it was 2006, by a scholar at the University of Michigan named Yuri Zhukov. And basically the argument was that the regions that had the strongest economic ties to Russia are where the separatist movement was most viable and where the most intense fighting happened. So I do very much want to move away from this kind of very essentializing idea that this is a civilizational conflict. I think that's the trope put out by much of the Kremlin's propaganda, and it's also, frankly, the trope put out by a lot of let's say the more hardline Ukrainian nationalists who basically cast this as, just a long, just one struggle in a long history of perpetual struggle between Russians and Ukrainians. And the point I try to make in my article is that actually it's far more complicated, and that the way to potentially resolve this is to address these issues of governance, degree of governance and quality of governance. So what can the government provide, and how well can it provide it? How transparently, how accountably, and how responsibly can the government meet the needs of its citizens? I'll just throw this out. We have a similar narrative going on about the Maidan, that this was a civilizational choice Ukrainians were making. And I'm fairly convinced that, yes, that was certainly present, that narrative was certainly present. But I'm really convinced that a lot of the people demonstrating saw the European Association Agreement first and foremost as a way to bring accountability to domestic politics. They were fed up. This is good, honest, hardworking, regular Ukrainian people. They were fed up with the endemic corruption. They were fed up with the endemic abuses that were going on within their own government. And they saw Europe as a way of inserting some mechanism of accountability internally. And I think this was much more of a profound driver than some wider idea of unambiguously turning geopolitically to Europe and away from Russia, because the evidence doesn't back that up. You were talking a little bit before about cultural affinities and sort of familial and personal affinities with Russia. I think there's no reason for Ukraine to abandon that. I think they won't be abandoned. There are profound ties to Russia. Even if there weren't, you're not going to change the position of the state, right? You share this long border, you share this long, complicated history between the two countries. The point of the matter is that I don't think it's a civilizational conflict. I don't think this means that if Ukraine gets better government, that it has turned away from Russia or the Russian people forever. I think it means it's turned away from Vladimir Putin's regime. And that's probably a good thing. But let's remember, Putin won't be in power forever either. The two things we have to keep in mind is that the first of these is that there is not a clear mandate on the Ukrainian side for joining NATO. And this is important to remember. It's vacillated a little bit. The belief that Ukraine should join NATO for obvious reasons was highest right after the Maidan or soon thereafter. It's vacillated a little since then. I think the latest polling data shows it's fallen off a little bit. But again, we're not getting the numbers from the entirety of Ukraine. Crimea is not being surveyed. We're not surveying the separatist-held areas. But the latest numbers I looked at this morning was a poll from December of 2015, and it shows that somewhere in the mid 40% range support, or say they would support, if a referendum were held and they voted joining NATO. That's still significantly lower than support for the EU. Support for the EU, at least in this poll, was over 50%. So there was a clear majority supporting Ukraine joining the EU. In terms of the wider region, though, we also have to be aware of what this means for NATO as a whole and for the security of Europe as a whole. The support for joining NATO, and this is something that Joanna brings out, is actually not very high. If I'm remembering her article correctly, I think support is highest in Poland for Ukraine joining NATO, but in some of the other states, Germany, France, and so forth, among the public at least, it's not very high. And the discussion there is obviously, well, what do we get out of this? We get potentially a more destabilized geopolitical situation. We get an angered Russia. This has all sorts of implications. Obviously, for a country like Germany, which has significant economic ties with Russia, it has a host of externalities that could potentially apply and go into effect. So the European-wide, at least at the mass level, perception of whether Ukraine should join NATO or not is, I don't want to say overwhelmingly negative, but it's certainly quite conflicted. So you have these two dynamics, both internally in Ukraine. There's not a clear mandate for joining NATO. There's also far less right now mandate for joining any kind of security union with Russia, though, I should say. So the default would be this neutrality that I think you were referencing, your acquaintances mentioning. In terms of how eager NATO is to have Ukraine within its fold, that remains to be seen. The problem, of course, is that this goes back to what I began talking about when we started this interview, is that it's not at all entirely clear that NATO or the key powers within NATO, or even the EU, have a clear vision for the future. Much of what happened in Ukraine, I think, caught them flat-footed. They're not quite sure how to respond. And you have really an internal conflict going on between those within these supranational, within these international organizations that very much want to take a hard line against Russia, to pull Ukraine in, to say, we're drawing a line in the sand, and those who are advocating much more of a measured and sort of wait and see approach, saying that, we really can't risk further destabilizing the situation. Russia has proven to be more of a wild card than they expected. This is not just the case in Ukraine. This is the case in places like Syria as well. And they urge caution moving forward. And there's yet another strand of thought that says we need a completely different security architecture, that one of the fundamental mistakes of the post-Cold War settlement, it wasn't so much settled as it was imposed on much of the post-communist world, was that we didn't move away from this idea of NATO, that we didn't offer some other vision that wasn't, or at least wouldn't be construed by Moscow as being adversarial. And make no mistake about it, the relationship is viewed very adversarially right now, although it wasn't. Even in the early 2000s, Putin made some noises about potentially Russia joining NATO. So just to briefly summarize, I think in terms of the regional situation, there's a great deal of uncertainty what it is that the powers that be in the Western European capitals, in Washington, D.C., will eventually agree on. And that uncertainty is breeding instability in the system that's quite challenging, and it's playing into wider dynamics as well. It's playing into the rise of populist nationalism in places like Poland as well, I think. Ukraine is quite rapidly coalescing. Ukraine is more united ideationally, conceptually, in many respects than it has been ever in its history. And the rapidity with which this happened, frankly, surprised me. Very much you still see regional divides present. I don't want to downplay that. And it's not as simple as this bifurcation between East and West. There are many different subregions, obviously, and even intra-regional variation, depending on local conditions, is pretty important to consider. But in terms of how quickly a more unified historical narrative has emerged in Ukraine, this did take me by surprise. Now, I want to be a little skeptical, because much of the polling data for this we have dates back from 2014, 2015, so there is this rally around the flag effect that is understandable. And we see some evidence that it's pulled back a little bit, at least since then. But what really struck me was how quickly a narrative of, let's say, the Holodomor as genocide spread throughout Ukraine. And obviously it's still lower in the East, but in relative terms, the increase in the number of people who accept this narrative of the famine as genocide has risen more rapidly in the East than it has in the West. I mean, in the West, it's very high. It was very high to begin with. The inroads are being made in the South and in the East. This, to me, was really surprising, the rapidity with which the basic interpretations of Ukrainian history have changed. And I actually think that in many respects, this could be very positive for building a sense of civic community, as long as this doesn't get taken over by essentially more xenophobic type of ethnic identity, right? But I think at the moment, at least, we seem to be seeing a consensus emerge in terms of the basic historical parameters of Ukrainian memory. Again, with pluralism evinced, but the contours are changing. They're moving more into a Western, what has traditionally been called a Western narrative. We're seeing more and more people, at least according to the survey data, accept the at least symbolic primacy of Ukrainian language as central to the identity of a Ukrainian state, but also allowing that Russian has a place. But the language issue, in some respects, is still salient, but I think, thankfully, in many regards, it's been disconnected from this idea of a Russian or a Russophile political identity. This is one of the few books out there that take a look at the security dimension in a more regional context, which I think is incredibly important because we don't want to lose Ukraine's contextualization. Ukraine does not exist without reference to its neighbors, without reference to its neighborhood, be that immediate neighbors, post-communist states, be that wider Europe. The other dimension I want to stress is I hope at least, that the book is coming out at an auspicious time. This is something that my co-editor has emphasized repeatedly. We are now far enough away from the events of the Maidan that we can take more of an objective and less of an emotional look at what happened in 2013, 2014, and what the aftermath, what the after effects of this were. But we're not yet far enough from these events that we're writing as historians. We're still able to analyze these events and their ramifications as social scientists, as international relations specialists, as political scientists. And finally, to just close, I would like to revisit this idea of the wider security infrastructure, the wider security infrastructure within the globe. I think it's important to remember that Ukraine is very much a part of this. In some ways, I hate to use this expression, canary in the coal mine, but what's happening in Ukraine is bringing home, in a very immediate sense, that maybe events in Georgia or events in Syria haven't for the Western world, that we are facing some profound challenges to the security status quo, to the global order such as it was. And this is going to require some very creative thinking and some very diplomatic thinking on the parts of all powers. And this is going to have to involve conversations with Russia. This is going to have to involve conversations with rising powers such as China. And of course, Europe, the United States have to have a seat at the table. And it's important not to forget that the countries whose fates lie in between all of this also have to have a seat at the table. So obviously, I think Ukraine should be very much involved in determining its own fate and in determining the wider security infrastructure, whether it's through joining NATO or through some other mechanism of not only that region of Europe, but Europe and the world more broadly.